Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with Anne Marie. And I hope you're enjoying this show. I love to have conversations with friends about what they've gone through in life or what they're passionate about, what they're going through, and how the Lord has really brought them through and how they're walking out their call in their walk with the Lord. So today I have another great guest, that's easy for you to say. Anyway, and this is my friend Linda Volkmer. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you.
I'm excited. I love the setting. I love the host, and I love being used by the Lord.
Well, thank you. So you have probably 100 testimonies you could share, but I think you were going to start and talk about how you walked through a devastating accident with your son. So
Yes.
Tell us a little about what that's going on.
Well, I'm the mother of 3 living children and 2 deceased, and Nate is the youngest. And at the time, years prior, I became a single mom when he was 8. And it was pretty traumatic because I was married to a Christian man. And so when he chose to leave, it was pretty traumatic for my family. And Nathan, being the youngest, sometimes acted it out. And so over the years, I, prayed. We always had devotions. We always had special time at night and in the morning. And I used to say to my kids, when they were getting ready to go to school, I would say, are you ready to go? And they would say, yes. And I would say, did you make your bed? Yes. Did you put on the full armor? And they would say, Mom. And I would say, you're going out in the real world. And if you don't have the full armor on, you're not ready to go out to school. So that was kind of the premise of how they a little bit grew up. And so when Mike left, Nate's dad left, Nate became much more volatile. And I had prayed over him many times, and I knew there was some spiritual conflict between how they were being raised, and so I really trusted the Lord because I didn't know exactly. I mean, I'd worked in spiritual warfare and all of that, but as the years passed, he had been in counseling. I had done everything I knew to do. And when he was 19, I called the kids. I used to walk 3 miles, and I would pray for the 3 kids. Each got a mile. One day I called the 2 older ones, and I said, change in plan. Nate gets 2 miles, and you each get a half. And we all knew that he was really struggling, and he was really rebelling. And so in the throes of that, I one day said to him, Nate, you know what? He's 6'5", and he thought he was a chick magnet, and some of the chicks thought he was. And but anyway, I said to him, Nate, you know what? You're running from God. And I was standing at the kitchen sink, and he said, oh, Mom. And I started my dishes. I just had a couple things in the sink, but they began to rattle because my hands were shaking. And he said, well, then he'll just have to stop me. And that's when my dishes began to rattle because I was like, you don't
tempt the Lord.
And so I started to cry, and he said, oh, ball, Mom. And he turned around and he went out the front door, and we lived in a 2-story Victorian home and in Wisconsin, and slammed the door, and he was furious, and he used some profanity and all of the above. And I began praying, saying, God, I was just overwhelmed because I know you challenged
Yeah.
and you will lose.
Yeah.
You may win in the end, but you will lose in the process.
Right.
And so my mom had just passed away. My dad had blood poisoning, was in the hospital, and so I was out of state. And I'd talked to Nate the night before, and typical son saying, "You didn't leave enough money, and you didn't leave enough food." And we had a really good conversation. And the thing with Nate was, when he was good, he was like the little girl, the little, nursery rhyme that says, when she was good, she was really, really good, and when she was bad, she was horrid.
really-
And that was my son. When things were good, he was lovely. And when they weren't, it was pretty ugly. And so I hung up the phone with him and was chatting with my dad. We'd just brought him home from the hospital. And the next day I get a phone call from the hospital. And they say, "Are you Mrs. Volkmer?" "Yes, I am." "Well, don't go anywhere. The doctor wants to speak to you." And then the nurse I was speaking to said, your son has been in an accident. And I said, "Do I need to come home?" And she misunderstood where I was coming from. She didn't know my circumstances. And she said, "Well, he's hurt his leg." And so I'm thinking, well, I have a couple friends that can handle that till I get there.
Right.
And he was 19, so he wasn't, 6. And in the throes of that, I went to the table with my dad and I said, "We need to pray." And I had never shared the totality of everything that Nate was going through. I didn't want to burden them with that, although they knew he was somewhat challenged. And so I waited, and about 20 minutes, went back to the phone, called, and just as I called, the doctor was coming out of the operating room, and he came, and he said, "Your son's been in an accident, and we couldn't locate you. Nobody knew. Everybody knew you were at your parents' or your dad's, but they didn't know your maiden name." And I never considered that was of essence, because that wasn't my last name.
Right.
So in the throes of that, he said, "Nate's just come through 13 hours of surgery."
Ooh.
And because he was 19, they didn't have to have my approval. And he said, "Your son's been in an accident, and I'm sorry you aren't here." And my response was, "God's everywhere mothers can't be." And that was my immediate response, and that was my immediate heart. And I shared with him a little bit about my circumstances, and I said, "I'll get there as soon as possible." They put him in an induced coma, and I made all the arrangements with family and so on for my dad's care. And my brother took me to Omaha. I jumped on a plane, and as I was on the plane, I said, "God, I'm sure I'm probably in shock. So please give me your word." And I opened up my Bible, and he gave me scripture out of Isaiah, and it was out of a translation I normally don't carry with me. But it said, "I will visit him in the time of distress, and I will restore him to perfect health." And I said, "God, if I'm wrong, I'll live with it, but I'm going to trust you." Because I'd asked him for the word.
Right.
And so I proceeded to Minneapolis, was snowed in Minneapolis, finally ministered to some people there that had trauma going on in their family with their children. Hit Green Bay, Wisconsin, was forgotten at the airport, finally get to the hospital. He's in a waiting room, and he's in traction. His head is twice the size that it should have been. And the neurosurgeon comes in and says, "You're Mrs. Volkmer." "Yes, I am." And his dad met me there. Our whole family was not scattered intentionally, but everybody, one was in Georgia, one was in South Carolina, one was in Minneapolis, I was, in Iowa. And so as we gathered, I went into his room, and his dad followed me, and I said, we need to pray. And he said, do your thing. And
His dad said that.
yeah, his dad said, oh, Lynn, go ahead and do your thing. And he was a believer that had kind of stepped away from his relationship with the Lord. And so I went in, and you always think as a parent, at least I did, what would happen if one of my kids was really in a horrible situation? And you can't really conceptualize how you're really going to respond.
Right.
But we called him Nader, one of the kids, one of his siblings did when he was little. And so I walked into the room and said, Nader, your mama's here. Everything's going to be okay. And I was trusting God in that. And, you know, he had nearly cut off extremities. He'd nearly cut his jugular. He had crushed his entire face. His eyeball was in the base of his jaw.
Oh my gosh.
He had obviously broke the arches in his cheeks, his jaw, and he had lost part of the iris. And, you know, he eventually had his mouth wired shut. I mean, it was...
Was this an auto accident?
It was an auto accident. And what had happened is he was going out on a hot date. And remember, he's a chick magnet, so he's dressed to the nines. He's coming home. He's by a golf course. There's a trailer tractor in the right-hand lane. And the tongue of the wagon went to veer, and so Nate thought he was pulling in front of him, so he went back, and he had started to pass, went back to the right-hand lane and drove his Jeep on a corn chopper wagon. Took 45 minutes for the EMTs to cut him out, nearly ran the steering wheel of his Jeep through his chest, lacked about an inch or so. And so they questioned him because they thought, for this magnitude, because the grill of his Jeep was pushed clear back to the steering wheel. And so they thought drugs or alcohol was involved, which that area has a lot of both. And so with that, so I arrive, and, you know, the doctor came in, he was really good, he was really thorough, and he said, he's damaged 4 quadrants to the brain, and you only have 4. And he said, but he's not bleeding out. And he said, he's going to go down, but he'll volley back up, and he's going to be fine because there's no swelling of the brain. Well, everything he said became just the opposite.
Oh, wow.
So the brain did begin to swell, and they had to put a stent into the skull and into the brain. And he didn't bleed in the brain, but he swelled. And so he ended up on a respirator. He ended up on, you know, every medical piece of equipment was in his room. And I just kept saying, God, I trust you. And it became, when I got to the hospital, there were 60 people waiting and praying. And so I don't take full credit for it by any means. And I really, just recently talking to Nate and saying I was going to do this broadcast, he said, Mom, can't you come up with something new? That's old information. And I said, it is to us, but to other people, miracles are always rebirthing.
Right.
So I said, it's not about you and it's not about me, it's about him.
Right.
It's about the Lord.
And it's about, as the title of this show said, it's about your saying yes.
It's always about yes. It isn't about, when, at least for me, when I yielded to the Lord as a kid, I remember my brother was messing with me driving home after I had, you know, gotten saved, been baptized, and I was driving home, and I knew that God had healed me from my sins, even though I was young.
Right.
And I said to him, don't mess with me because I'm perfect. And you're going to mess it all up. And obviously I was already messed up. But so when Nate was there, I had worked with many people coming out of the occult. And I'd worked with a pastor and his wife and another woman. And, so I was like, okay, if I would fight for somebody else, I have to fight for my own son.
Absolutely.
And so I was like, God, and I told, when I prayed with my dad, I said, God, if you choose to take him before I get home, it's okay. It's okay. I know who he is, and I know who you are, and I trust you. And so as I went in, they immediately, shortly after, took him into ICU, and he was going the wrong direction. And so with all the monitors and everything, he ended up having 38 hours of surgery.
Wow.
And but in the throes of that, I became pretty radical. He's in ICU, and I knew everybody thought, oh, there's one of those crazy Christians, And so one day I literally prayed warfare in the heavens, and I asked God to fight on our behalf. And I asked angels to war, and I prayed over him. I anointed him with oil. I anointed cloths and put him in the pillow. And one day God said, I want you to lay up on your son. And I was like, oh, no, that's not God. Let me revamp this. And I heard it right. And I was like, God, I don't even know how to do that. And he said, I want you to be like Elijah and speak life. And so he says, drop the railing on the bed, put your chest over his chest, and speak life into him. And I have kind of a warped sense of humor, so I said, oh, so he's not going to die from being crushed in the accident, but the obits are going to say, son dies by mother crushing him to death. And
Now, you mentioned Elijah, and so in case anybody out there doesn't know what that's referring to,
Right.
is Elijah had prophesied over a woman who had not been able to bear a child,
Right.
and she bore this child, but then in his probably preteens, early teens,
Yes.
he died.
Yeah.
And she was like, how dare you prophesy me?
Yes.
I got used to not having a son or not having a child. Now you gave me him, now you're taking him away.
Yes, yes.
And he came and he went up because the child had just died, and he went up and laid on top of the child, and life came back into that child.
Yes.
So that's kind of
Thank you
where,
for qualifying that.
yeah. So just
Thank
in
you.
case you didn't know what that reference. So, but God has unique ways to deal with things. Just like when Jesus was healing people in the streets, he didn't always do it the same way.
That's right. That's
You know,
right.
he was creative.
Absolutely.
So-
Absolutely.
Anyway, so he didn't die by getting crushed in the accident. He didn't die by mom crushing him.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm sorry I had to interrupt. So
No,
let's
that
go
was
on
good.
with
I'm
the
glad
story.
you did. So anyway, people were praying all around the hospital, people that I knew that even worked as administrators in the hospital would come in and check on how he was and so on. And I ministered to, I administered to lots of people that were unchurched. And I had gone on a 40-day fast prior to his accident. And I talked to one of the pastors at our church, and he said, I just get you need to have courage and fast. And I was like, well, most people wouldn't say I was real wimpy. And and he just kind of laughed. And I got in the car and I said, God, God said 40 days. I had never done a 40-day fast. I'd fasted many times, but not 40 days. I'd done complete fasts, but not 40 days. And so I did that. And over that 40-day fast, I was like, God, it was really good, but I don't know that I gleaned anything. But when he had his accident, God used me to just evangelize all kinds of
Right.
people.
Right.
And so as he's in recovery, so are a lot of other people. And so God would send me into various people's room and I would pray for them. And one man who was not a believer, really questioned God at all levels, said, I can't believe you came into my room because I just told God, if you're really real, you better make it known to me. And he had been crushed between two trucks. So he was in excruciating pain in his mid-30s. And after I talked to him and prayed with him and God moved, he said, when I walk on the right side of the hallway, I will be praying for my healing. When I walk on the left side, I'll be praying for your son. And that's really how God moved in many, many people's lives.
It's amazing how God does this.
Oh,
Saying,
absolutely.
Lord, if you're real, you better show up. And then
Yes.
it's like, boom.
Yes.
He
And he
shows
was
up.
shocked. He cried. He was like, he was speechless.
And sometimes, you'll see a Christian movie and they'll have something like that happen, and you think, okay, well, they can do that in the movie.
Yeah,
Whatever. But
exactly.
in reality, God moves that way.
He does move that way.
He does
And he
move.
moves, I think we underestimate. I don't think we always take the word for what the word says. So we underestimate his love for his children, for his people, for I think about the scripture that says he came for those that were sick and afflicted, not for those that were well.
Right.
And I always say, no one stoops so low that God will not go underneath them and lift them up.
Right.
And I'd gotten to the place before Nate's accident. I said, God, you do with Nate whatever you need to do, and
Right.
I'll praise you at all cost.
But maybe this accident was exactly what God needed to do with Nate.
So totally was. I'm not saying God caused it,
No, but he allows
but
things.
he allows
Right.
certain things. And I think the enemy, Satan's goal was to kill him, but God spared.
Right.
And God said, I got a bigger plan. And so in the throes of that, Nate kept having surgeries, and we had a family friend who in Awana had befriended, the man had been a missionary, befriended Nate, kind of pulled him under his wing, and kind of served as that father encouragement. And he would come to his room and pray with me and pray with me and pray with me and his family. And, Nate's dad was there, his sister, his brother. My oldest son was at Springfield Evangel, and he left school to come home and undergird Nate. And so we really stood pretty united, even though it was a severed family.
Right.
And some people did better than others. But so in the throes of that, Nate is still in the coma, and the doctor comes in, the neurosurgeon says, Mrs. Volkmer, your son's going to die. And I said, I listened, and he said, you'll either pull the meds off. He had a trach, he had a shunt in his head and all these things, and his leg had been in traction. He lost 5 inches out of his right leg, and all these things had occurred. But however, he gave me 3 options, and I said, I feel like I'm Bob Barker, and I got to choose one of the doors. And he kind of, laughed. I kind of laughed, and I said, I hope you will hear what I have to say. My son's going to impact your life, and you'll never be the same again. And I hope you respect what I have to say as much as I respect you. We stood by his bed praying and interceding, and my daughter said, Mom, if I knew he was right with Jesus, I could let him go. And I said, Michelle, that's not your concern. I mean, it's your concern, but that's between him and Jesus. And we went home and we talked, and they were wanting me to donate organs and all those kind of things. And my daughter said, Mom, you can't live in denial. I said, I'm not living in denial, but if I'm wrong, I'll live with it. And she said, well, you thought Dad was coming home too. And I said, well, I stood on what God gave me. And so I said, I'll live with this too. So in the throes of that, I go back to the hospital, and the nurse runs out of ICU and said, I had gone to get coffee. I'd been told he was the same. And she says, Mrs. Volkmer, I don't know what you're doing, but I went to shave your son. He moved his body this way, and I went to shave the other side, and he moved it the other way. And the fast forwarding, by the next day, he had opened his eye, just one, as we were praying. The next week, he was 5 days out of ICU. He was in rehab for 5 years.
And he is doing how today?
He is an amazing man of God. He has been married 1 year, and he will call me and say, Mom, you aren't going to let the enemy have that kind of handle on you, are you? Mom, you need to climb higher. So I had said to the Lord, if you aren't going to heal him, take him home. And God totally is restored.
So he tempted God, and you put him in God's hands. God created, but he allowed this horrific accident
Absolutely.
to happen, and he used it. And your son, who was tempting God and rejecting him, is now serving him. And a lot of it comes from not only the accident waking him up, but Mom and an army of saints
Yes.
saying, yes, I'm going to keep going. Well, we are like down to the wire here.
Yes.
So I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Coffee and Tea with Anne-Marie. But come back next week, because we're going to hear more of Linda's testimonies and life stories. And this one was called Just Say Yes, but next week is Still Saying Yes. So come back. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.